Hello, everybody. This is the Unit 6 AP Euro review. A little different angle today. The exercise bike is in the shop. Okay, so like it says back here, Unit 6 is going to be largely about industrialization and the after effects of industrialization. 6.1, contextualizing industrialization and its origins and effects. So this is great context if you get an Industrial Revolution essay, that the Industrial Revolution is going to begin in Great Britain, and for a number of reasons. Natural, geographical, natural resource type reasons. They have coal, things like that. They have rivers, they have canals. It's more navigable. Shipping is cheaper. It stimulates the economy when you're spending less and less money on shipping costs. Thinking about the political system and having a constitutional monarchy and why that matters. In a lot of absolute monarchies or maybe more authoritarian governments, the economy is certainly going to be limited based on the wishes of the monarch or whoever is in power. But if we have a constitutional monarchy and we have a parliament in England and we have dozens and dozens of members of parliament, a lot of those members of parliament are businessmen and, captains of industry and things like that. So they stand to gain when the government passes laws and statutes that are pro-business, right? And so the type of government a country is going to have is going to make a difference when it comes to what kind of economy they have. So some of the other reasons of the Industrial Revolution starting in Britain, right? The lack of wars or lack of conflict on the island itself, and there's not those disruptions. And so these kind of things that are developing in England can develop unfettered, right? There's nothing getting in the way. There's no wars. There's no conflicts for the most part, or for a long, long time there's not. Looking forward, some of the other concepts in this unit, the societal effects, what are the results of mass industrialization and then urbanization, and new types of government, new economic and political philosophies, a new sense of self, class consciousness, and everything else. Same thing with the Industrial Revolution, looking at those working conditions, the results of those things, family structure and how it's going to change based on who is expected to work and who isn't, and that new class of wealthy people, right? That class of people who are going to become wealthy due to industrialization, right? The business owners and those individuals who control certain resources. And again, new political ideologies developing out of the Industrial Revolution. That post-industrialization capitalism will start to have some critiques, and different forms of government will form out of that. 6.2. Again, understanding, like I kind of previewed, Britain is going to industrialize through private enterprise, right? It is not the government leading these things. It is Parliament, or I shouldn't say that, it is individuals leading this push, and a lot of those individuals are members of Parliament. So when those members of Parliament are writing up laws and enacting laws, they certainly are going to have the economy in mind, and will have those ideas more so in mind than, say, an absolute monarchy in another country. So thinking about kind of what parts of Europe benefit the most from industrialization, certainly Britain, but it's Western Europe, right? France, Germany, or Prussia will certainly industrialize, while Eastern Europe, meaning Russia, and Southern Europe, the Balkans, and so the Ottoman Empire, and amongst other countries, are going to lag behind, right? And just the gap between them is going to become nearly insurmountable, as Western Europe is, again, industrializing. Also, they are modernizing agriculture as well, needing less and less manpower or labor on the farms. That's that many more people that can now go to the cities and help boost industrialization, right? And if Eastern and Southern Europe are still culturally or socially in that kind of pseudo-feudalism of a caste system, and you have your lords and your serfs, and the serfs have to stay on the land, then everything else is going to naturally suffer as far as innovation and advancements. Second wave industrialization. So we didn't really get to this topic, and we should have, but there are two industrial revolutions, right? And so the first industrial revolution, which we did talk a lot about, is the transition from handmade manual production to machine production that is largely going to be powered by water or steam, and coal, and early coal plants. The second, and so that's going to be late 1700s into the early 1800s, and the second industrial revolution is late 1800s, and that's going to be more modern things, right? Electricity, combustion engines, chemicals, telegraph, things that maybe that we are certainly familiar with, right? Not that we're not familiar with textiles and things. So this is going to really bring into a modern society, right? You're thinking about having electricity being a telltale sign that you live in a modern society, right? Having a car, having an engine, having a vehicle that can move things for you. All these things are things that we probably certainly take for granted, but this is a just as big a shift as the first industrial revolution was. So the big picture here is, by the time we're getting to the 1900s, factories are everywhere, and that's by far the predominant, like it says there, mode of manufacturing. Making things by hand has been left in the dust. We have global economies. All these major European industrialized countries have colonies, have access to all sorts of resources. They can manufacture them back in Europe, and then they sell them all over the world, right? Europe is the heart of the world economy, and we do have a global economy. Thinking about the growth in economies due to industrialization, how many jobs that exist in, say, 1890 literally didn't exist in 1790, right? You think about today in 2020 or the 21st century, how many jobs out there that literally didn't exist that long ago, right? The guy who works at the cashier at the gas station, the guy who runs security at a sports game, right? None of those jobs existed. And with new technologies, new innovations, those jobs are created, and economies are constantly, if we are developing technology, in theory, they're constantly expanding. So it's always, even if we're going to talk about some negatives in the Industrial Revolution here in a second, it certainly is a net positive, right? I guess you can't really argue that due to industrialization as a whole, society has improved, right? Obviously, there's some individuals who become that collateral damage and who maybe suffer greatly. But the overall picture is society moves forward and quality of life certainly increases during the Industrial Revolution. Some political effects is Prussia is going to be a major leader in industrialization in Central Europe. And as we get into the late 19th century and unification is on the horizon, there's no wonder why Prussia leads that, right? And Prussia becomes the dominant German state. We mentioned in class a while back about the military and their more martial ways, right? Frederick the Great's father, Frederick William, the Soldier King. And as we get into, the battle between Prussia and Austria and Prussia and these other German states for supremacy, Prussia is certainly going to come out on top, in no small part due to industrialization. The social effects, how did society change due to industrialization? So a big one, class consciousness. And people being aware that they are perhaps being exploited by a smaller, more influential class above them. And so this is primarily for those wage workers, right, who work and toil in the factories, that they're making, low wages while their bosses or owners, I should say factory owners, are making much more money than them and doing quite a bit less manual labor, and being aware of that. And, so peasants for hundreds of years, they certainly knew their station in life, but they're not aware of the exploitation, right? They're not aware of how the kings and nobility really live when you are, stuck on that plot of land for your entire life. And that's not the same when you're living in a city, right? You see different classes of people, realize, there are people who have more rights essentially than you, have more stuff than you, and maybe you resent that. Just a reminder about bourgeoisie, right? That's a class that's always been there. It's just getting larger now. And these wealthy factory owners, these wealthy business owners who are going to represent the bourgeoisie in the 1800s. And thinking about that shift as far as who influences government now. And it used to be nobility would influence the monarchy, right? It would influence the crown based on things they wanted and needed, and based on how much money or power they had. That's going to change how much influence they can muster. But now you think about what's the equivalent of nobility as we get into the Industrial Revolution. That's going to be your extremely wealthy factory owners and those who control certain industries, right? And now they influence government, and now they influence these things because they have so much money, because they have so much influence. So the bourgeoisie is a smaller, right, wealthy business class. The proletariat is that poor working class, the class that is being exploited by the bourgeoisie, right? The proletariat works, and if you follow more Marxist ideologies, it's the bourgeoisie that's going to benefit from them, right? So that is, again, a Western European thing. Industrialization is largely a Western European thing. In Eastern Europe, not that you have zero industrialization, but certainly nobles are still that secondary power in Eastern Europe. Thinking about the issues of cities growing too fast, when you have pollution and overcrowding, and when there's too much competition for jobs, wages go down, or there's unemployment, and unemployment brings crime. There's a lot of societal ills that come out of overpopulation. So the nuclear family stuff on that bottom bullet is you start to get that idea of what a proper family looks like, right? And the family that everyone strives to be if you have some money. So, that kind of stereotypical nuclear idea of a father that works and a mother that stays home and takes care of the kids. And so that's the goal, right? If you're in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that's the goal of a family, to have one wage earner and then the mother that takes care of the house and children. And so if that is the goal of society at large, then certainly laws reflect those goals, right? And maybe you start seeing laws about child labor to keep them out of the workforce and in the home or in school, to promote that sort of lifestyle, or promoting the idea of distinct gender roles, that women only have a handful of jobs they can do, and besides that, they need to stay at home, right? And if those are the societal kind of boundaries enforced on everybody from day one, then society is going to reflect that for sure, right? And so you have that very distinct separate spheres, that men do this, women do this, and there's very little that goes in between in the Venn diagram that both men and women are going to partake in. All right, shifting gears away from industrialization for a minute, the concert of Europe and European conservatism. So a reminder, when we're looking at someone like Metternich, the Austrian diplomat, right? He is going to lead that sort of, I don't know if conspiracy is the right word, but the major European powers, the monarchs, the kings of those countries will work together to prevent revolution and to maintain the status quo across all of Europe, because they have that vested interest together, right? Even if I'm, say, British, and I don't like the French at this moment, I still don't want the French monarchy to fall, because that idea can spread to me, right? Even if I don't like the French, I still want them to be a to be a monarchy. And so thinking about, burgeoning nationalism in the 1800s, and Metternich is trying to resist that nationalism, right? Because those big countries, and Austria is a great example, the Ottoman Empire is another great example of these big multi-ethnic states that are kind of this hodgepodge of half a dozen, or I guess I could say tens and dozens of nationalities. And if nationalism takes over in those regions, those big multi-ethnic countries, they stand to get destroyed. And maintaining that balance of power, right? Once you have it, you don't want one country getting weaker or one country getting stronger, because it has a domino effect, right? You want to maintain that status quo the best you can, because that's going to prevent war and prevent revolution. So Metternich is going to kind of try to nip these issues in the bud, right, to stop them before they happen. So the Carlsbad Decree is a good definition to have an idea of these ways of limiting fraternization in colleges or universities to stop these young revolutionaries or potential revolutionaries from discussing certain ideas, reading certain pamphlets, whatever that may be, and then trying to promote the Catholic Church as that unifier, right? That traditional authority that keeps people in line. All throughout all these things we've talked about over the last 7-8 months now, the church is still that big unifier behind it. And yes, there's been schisms and Protestantism and Catholicism and everything else, but that is something that if you are trying to maintain the status quo, you need the church as that kind of backbone to society. Okay, you don't want revolutionaries minimizing the importance of the church, like maybe the radical Jacobins did with Robespierre with the French Revolution. 6.6, reactions and revolutions. And so that turning point of the 19th century, those largely failed revolutions of 1848. And we talked about how one of the reasons they fail, or maybe the most important reason they fail, is the lack of cohesion between all the revolting groups, right? There's socialists and nationalists and lowercase r Republicans and everything else. And they can't come to a conclusion on how do we maintain that revolution? How do we succeed if we all have different ideas of what success is? So even though those revolutions fail in 1848, it is sort of that beginning of the end of that age of conservatism with Metternich, right? They were able to maintain it for the most part. France has a successful revolution, but for everybody else, the writing's on the wall, right? That things are going to change in Europe, and they're going to change pretty quickly. Some examples of nationalism or successful nationalist uprisings, right? The War of Greek Independence, 1830, the people of Greece fight a war of independence and win. And nationalism is going to be something that is everywhere, be it Africa, Europe, or Asia, whatever, throughout this time period, because it's just kind of a natural consequence of being conquered by a foreign power. And so if the Ottomans are conquering Southeastern Europe and North Africa and all these places all over that part of the world, it's not like nationalism is just a European phenomenon, right? Egyptians are going to be nationalists whenever they're controlled by the Ottomans. When we get into the imperialism in 1800s and 1900s, the Vietnamese will be nationalist against the French, or whatever example you want. There's dozens, right? And so nationalism is a kind of worldwide phenomenon. It's kind of an intellectual shift where people start identifying as their ethnicity and are going to resist any kind of foreign rule. In France, you have another revolution, right? And you have the first presidential election in, I guess, European history, but in France, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte wins, the nephew of Napoleon the First, right? The famous Napoleon from the French Revolution. He's president for 4 years and then names himself emperor for life, and the people largely embrace this. Okay, now we have France as an empire again. Tsar Alexander II, right, frees the serfs. We had that quote, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. It's better to, free the serfs from the top down than from the bottom up. It's better that I free these serfs and have some kind of control over the next step, as opposed to them revolting and then who knows what happens, right? A theme that kind of wraps up the 1800s here is Russia is going to be forced to modernize after the embarrassment of the Crimean War. It's kind of the same thing with the Ottomans, right? It's just proof that these Eastern powers, Russia, the Ottoman Empire as examples, are not going to be able to compete with the Western industrialized countries. And Russia is going to have to force modernization, right? And, we don't make it this far into World War II and Stalin and everything, but that's certainly a theme to Russian history from, the late mid 1800s until the collapse of the Soviet Union, I guess, where they are going to force this modernization with that command economy. Command economy being when they're communism. Anyway, ideologies of change and reform movements. So thinking about the different types of political philosophies and economic philosophies that come out of the Industrial Revolution. So first of all, understanding this idea of suffrage, right, or sovereignty. That's not the right word I'm looking for, but it's suffrage, right? People voting. And at the time, if you believe that all nobody or very few people think women should vote in the 1800s. But if you had the idea that every adult male should vote, that would make you a radical, right? Because you are opening up voting and power to a lot of people who traditionally have had zero. And I kind of gave that silly example in class. How would politicians or politics fundamentally change if they lowered the voting age to 12? How many millions of new voters are there that suddenly have real power, and how are those politicians or those governments going to appeal to them? It's the same thing if you're a 40 something 50 something year old wealthy male in Europe in the 1800s. The last thing you want is a lot of poor people voting, because now suddenly the governments have to appeal to those people, and there's always more poor people than rich people, and so they stand to lose things, right? If poor people suddenly are voting in their best interest. Socialism, right? The reaction to the large accumulations of wealth by these industry owners and factory owners. And it's like it says there, social, a redistribution of those resources and wealth amongst the community or society. Karl Marx and Marxism and communism, right? The critiques of capitalism are that, all of human history is class warfare, rich versus poor, be that, the patricians and the plebeians in ancient Rome, the lords and the peasants in feudalist Rome, or feudal Rome, I should say, or feudal Europe, or now with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? That it's always the rich minority taking advantage of the poor majority. And so the idea of Marxism, of communism, is if you can remove that class warfare, then those conflicts will go away, right? The same ideas with wars. Wars are fought on the whims of rich people, be that kings or governments or whatever, and it's poor people that fight those wars. And so if you can remove those ideas of classes and the idea of Marx, you would, remove any kind of conflict, be that international or domestic. And then you have anarchism, the belief that all governments are invalid, right? That no government naturally has any kind of power over me, and for them to force me to do something with their laws or statutes is unnatural. And I will only cooperate voluntarily if I feel like it is a worthy cause or worthy notion. 6.8, 19th century social reforms. Thinking about, the major shift when we do have mass politics now, millions of new enfranchised voters, and the political parties that come out of them, because political parties are an easy way to make politics digestible for somebody, right? You have this party or this party or this party, and here's kind of a basic platform that you might associate yourself with, right? And so when we do have all these people that can vote now, you do start to see people, or I should say parties and politicians, trying to track large swaths of people, right? What are the handful of things that I can say, if you vote for me, I'll do this, remove this, blah, blah, blah. And politics are becoming more streamlined. Labor unions becoming a major part of politics, that now labor unions are starting to have real power if they feel like they're not being paid fairly, or their working conditions are bad or dangerous. They have real power with the threat to strike. Throughout all of this, right? And I always bring this up, and I don't, certainly is not trying to be facetious or anything, but just understanding it's not until World War I and World War II that there are major advancements in women's rights. And so it's a very slow go, and there's always these female philosophers that are in each unit, and just understanding, they are a minority of minorities. Okay. And so it's, again, not until we get into a very modern era that we start to see a big shift on this. And so a possible essay you can get is that continuity and change type essay, where, you say, how have these things stayed the same and how these things changed? And if you get one about women's role in society throughout, basically any time period that could potentially be under DBQ next Wednesday, then, there's a lot more continuities than there are changes. 6.9, last one, or second to last one, institutional responses and reform. So as these cities get large, they get, filthy, dangerous, whatever, governments obviously are going to have to react to those. So a big one is the laissez-faire policies of like Adam Smith. That's going to get shifted just because industrialization fundamentally changes the economy, right? The economies are no longer these kind of slow, easily controllable things with factories and machines and everything else. Things have shifted. And so, yes, there is still capitalism, but now in any country in the world, governments are going to have at least a certain amount of influence on what's being made and the prices on it. The reaction again to this kind of poor public health would be more modern sewage systems, cleaner water, tearing down old dilapidated slums and things that have been around for decades and were poorly built to begin with. Figuring out ways to let people spread out and do that with public transit, right? If I can hop on a trolley or whatever, and I can live 5-6 miles from where I work, and so can the other 500 people in my building, we don't have to live right on top of each other because I have to walk to work every morning. Trying to bring some sort of idea of rural life into an urban area, some kind of outdoor area, public park. And, this seems kind of trite maybe, but just thinking about how important it would be if you lived in an urban environment to have some sort of, I don't know, nature aspect in your city. The last one, compulsory education. And there's a lot of reasons for this, right? And so there's 3 reasons that we're going to talk about for the reason that societies and countries want an educated citizenry, right? The first one, public order, that in theory, if you have been introduced to your laws and how they work and what the punishments are, and you go through the, rituals and things of school, that when you get out of school, you'll be a more law-abiding citizen, right? Nationalism, this pride in your country. Think about every day during third hour in high school, and whenever we did it back in the middle school or whatever, how many times have you said the Pledge of Allegiance? And what else is the purpose of that besides to increase nationalism and increase awareness of what country you live in, right? And economic growth, that economies will grow and expand if they have more skilled workers. If I'm any business owner, right, you don't want to hire an uneducated person who couldn't make it through the 8th grade to work at your place and be an employee of yours. You want to try to hire somebody who's proven that they've met this minimum of education. Okay, 6.10, causation in the age of industrialization. Britain's again already established itself as a world power and will be that well into the 20th century. But beyond just Britain, thinking about as we get into Unit 7, which will be imperialism, just how important the Industrial Revolution is to making Europe a power, right? That because it starts there and then spreads out from that area, that is going to be a reason Europe is so successful in this time period. Okay, so there's Unit 6. I will be posting Unit 7 very soon. You guys have your AP Euro test next Wednesday. Thanks, guys.